If you have just been learning HTML and CSS and are looking for a cool and amazing project to build, then this video is for you. In this video, we'll take your web development journey a step further by building a cool and simple character counter using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's get right into it. Let's create our HTML file, which we'll call index.html. We'll then generate our boilerplate code and change the title to character counter. Inside the body of our HTML file, we'll create a div with the class name container, and inside that div, we'll create another one with the class name main. For our main, we want to have an h1 tag with the class name heading, and the heading text would be character counter, just like this. Beneath the character counter, we want to have an input box, right? A div with the class name input box, and inside that div we would have a text input with the class name text input, as well as a span with the class name counter. Good, just like this. So let me just make this a little more beautiful. Boom, there we have it. So that's it for our HTML file. Let's preview it using the live server. Boom, just like that. Just like that. We have our HTML file opened in the browser. The next thing we'll do is to style it with CSS. So we'll split our screen between the browser and our text editor. We'll then go ahead to create our styles.css file, and then we'll link it to our HTML file. Right beneath the title tag, let's link our CSS file. Just like this, and we have it linked. Let's begin writing our CSS. The first thing we'll do is use the universal tag to set every margin to 0. We'll set every padding as well to 0, and for the box sizing property, we'll set it to border box. In this project, our font family is going to be Verdana. Just like this. Good. Having done that, the first thing we'll style is our container class. For the container class, we want it to fill up our whole screen, so we'll set the width to 100%, and we'll set the height to 100 viewport height. Let's give it a background so that we can see what we are working with. For the background, the color is going to be AA57CC. That's a nice purple or indigo color there. Very beautiful. One other thing we would want to do is to center everything in our container class. In order to achieve this, we'll set the display to flex and the justify content to center, as well as the align items to center. Very beautiful, just like that. And we have everything centered in the middle. Let's start our main class, our main div, We'll give it a background color of white so that we can distinguish it from our background, just like that. Now, we don't want our text and our input touching or colliding with the borders of our main class, so we'll give it a padding of 24 pixels just to separate it. Let's now round the corners of our main by giving it a border radius of about 5 pixels, and we'll set a box shadow property on our main div. For the X, we are going to have 4 pixels, and for the Y, we would have 8 pixels. Set our blur to 16 pixels, and the color is going to be black, right? So we use RGBA, and we just set everything to 0, and our alpha will be 0.2. That's our opacity. Good. So you can see some shadow right beneath our box here. I think this is looking good for the meantime. So we'll do just that. Let's move on to style the heading. For the heading, what we would want to do with our heading is to give it a margin bottom to separate it from our input box. So we'll do a margin bottom and we'll give it 8 pixels, just like that, a little separation, and I think it's looking beautiful now. Don't forget, in our HTML, we had a span here. We didn't pass anything into it, so we couldn't see it. Let's enter the number 24. Back to our CSS. For our input box, we want to set the display to flex and give it a gap of 8 pixels to create a separation between our input element here and the span. Having done that, let's now style our text input. For the text input, would have the width. No, we'll not give it a width. We set the height property to 48 pixels. Let's round the corners a bit. I think it's already rounded. So we'll give it an outline of none. When we click on it, you can see that it has a very ugly outline. So let's set the outline to none. And we'll give it some padding to separate the text from its borders. Let's give it a padding of 12 pixels. Right. Now, this is the reason why we set our input box to display flex. You notice that the span here is not aligned properly with it. So on our input box, we'll simply give it an align items of center. Boom, like that. We'll later on correct this, but I think for now this is just fine. Moving on, let's give our text input a border of 1 pixel solid, and the color we would use here would be 2COB2D. I think that's a nice color. It looks good. It just blends well with our background and the white color. So we'll stick with that for now. And we would increase the font size of our input element. Would make it 1.3 rem. Hence, when we put in some text here, it will look good. Very importantly, we want to go back to our HTML file and set the max length attribute of our text input to 24, just like this. Those would mean that after we have inputted 24 characters into our input, we can no longer input anything in it. We can no longer enter any text. That will come very handy when we are writing our JavaScript. Back to our CSS file. The very last thing we want to style is our counter. So inside the input box, we have a counter there. For the counter, let's set the height to 50 pixels. We want it to have a background color of, let's give it this purple color, the same color as our background, which I think is beautiful. Now we'll give it a display. If you notice where our text is way up there, we want to bring it to the down. One of the ways we can do this is simply by using the display of flex. We'll justify content center and align items center. Good, just like this, and we can see that. Now let's give it a padding to make it much better. So we'll give it a padding of 16 pixels. I think that will work just fine. Let's see. Okay, that looks good. It looks good. And we'll change. Let's try and work with the text color of white, FFF, to see what. Okay, I think black is better. The black was better. So we'll leave that way. We'll leave that way. Let's increase the font size a bit. We'll set the font size to the same thing we had for our input element, 1.3 rem. Good. I think it's much better like this. So let's enter a text code invasion. Yeah, I think our app is looking good. I think this looks good. On our heading, let's center our heading by giving it a text align of center. Boom. Much better. It looks much better now. So we are done, and let's go and write our JavaScript. To do that, let's create our JavaScript file, which we would name script.js, and in our HTML file, we would import it, Alt+Z, to make my code wrap, and right beneath the CSS link, we would import our JavaScript file. Very importantly, if you are going to import an external JavaScript file, we need to bring the defer attribute, right? This simply helps our browser to run much more smoothly so that there will be no blocking. Are we on the same page? You can read this in VS Code, this pop-up here. You would get much better insight and clarity on that. Let's move on quickly. Two things we would want to import in our JavaScript file, or two things we would want to select, is this input here as well as this span here. Now they both have a class name of text input and counter respectively, so that's what we are going to use. We are going to use the query selector. Let's do const text input equals, and we'll pass in the class name text input. Now let's duplicate this line of code and change what's right here. Good, just like that, and we are good to go. Usually I would log to the console to see if I got this right. So let's log our counter and our text input to the console just to see if we had it right. Now if we move to our browser and we right click and select inspect, we'll have this window here coming up. We can simply click on console right here, and boom, there we have it. We have our span and we have our input. That means our first two lines of code works properly. Having done that, we can now delete this line of code and close this. What we are gonna do is that we are gonna, first of all, if we have the text input value equal to 0, the length, right, equal to 0, we want to set the counter inner text to 0. So counter dot inner text equals 0, right? Boom, and there we have it, because there's nothing in this input here, right? Moving forward, we would simply add an event listener, which would be the event key app, such that when a user enters a value, this callback function will be fired. Before we write our callback function, on our HTML, we gave our input a max length, right, of 24. So we'll simply select that as well. So let's do let max length equals, then we'll use the get attribute selector, just like that, to select the max length or retrieve the max length. Boom. Now, if we log this to the console as well, we'll see 24, but we won't do that now. We can now go ahead and write this callback function. What we are gonna do is we are gonna set the inner text of our text input to be the length of the value the user has entered into our text input over the max length. Just like this. We don't want any spacing here, sorry. And we'll have something like this, max length. Good. So that's it for our JavaScript file. Now, let's try it out and see. If we enter the name code invasion, boom. Now, if we enter more, we can see that we have 24 over 24 and we can't enter any other text.